RevOpsAF, the only podcast for people who are RevOpsAF and want to learn all about things that are RevOps AF.
Our goal is to give the revenue operations community, that includes marketing, sales, and CS, for any of you not paying attention, the skills needed to accelerate their careers. Hello and welcome to RevOps AF, the podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Camela Thompson, and today I'm joined by Kristina Kardell. Kristina, tell us a little bit about your background.
Hi, so first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I started my career as a management consultant many years ago. I studied business and management before that, so going into consulting was the typical crash course in the business world. While I was a consultant, I worked with fast-growing tech scale-ups as well as larger listed companies, really getting to see a lot of these companies growing very quickly and the challenges that they were facing. And after a while, I figured I wanted to be part of one of those journeys myself. So I switched sides and then started working in revenue operations here at Leapsome. So that's almost 3 years ago. So it's been a hell of a journey. Pardon my French, but it's been a really fun challenge seeing the company grow and doing every little bit of revenue operations across the funnel and go-to-market strategy. So that's where I am today.
I always joke that RevOps ages us in dog years. So 3 years is really like 21 years in regular.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you have startup years, which is also dog years. So I feel like that even multiplies maybe even further.
Yeah, we've seen some stuff by this point.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh yeah, no, I blame all of mine on my past bosses. It's fine. They know it too. It's great.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be talking about aligning with the overall strategy. We're going to talk about the elephant in the room right away. It seems nebulous and it can be really hard to get to what the actual strategy is. And sometimes they don't really want to tell you that their plan is to sell in 2 years or whatever it is that would make you worry about long-term stability. So how do you recommend people go about sleuthing out the real overall objective they should be chasing?
I would say my genuine hope is that RevOps as a function and maybe at least the head of RevOps is part of the strategy process or part of the go-to-market planning process. I know we at least are. So we facilitate that whole process, even though we're not the people necessarily setting the agenda in the end. We're at least facilitating that process. But what I do think is a way to get there is really trying to nail down at least year over year, even though you may not know, it could be 5 years, what do we want to achieve. But when we're looking at the next year and we're doing a budget, a financial plan, a strategy for the upcoming year, really try to nail down the maybe 3 or 4 must-win battles, the sort of key things that you need to move as a company in that coming year. And here I think revenue operations is such an interesting player because we really look at this from the holistic go-to-market point of view. We don't have only sales or marketing or CS. So for me, I try to phrase it as a question to my go-to-market leadership team. So usually have, for example, a growth target, but how do we actually get there? So I try to challenge them by saying, okay, if we now make these things happen, will that get us to our goal? So it's trying to narrow down what is actually the sort of big bets we need to work on across the go-to-market. So really trying to feed the conversation, I think is really helpful because that way you can also challenge them and nudge them and really push them to really answer those questions because otherwise they're just going to try to tend to their own side of the house. So that's how we work. And then it's sort of like an iterative process and trying to identify those big bets. And then at the end, I feel like you can ask the question, okay, so if all of this now comes true, will that mean that we've succeeded in the upcoming year? So really trying to have that dialogue in identifying the kind of big bets or big levers or whatever you want to call them. That's like the main things that you need to succeed in the upcoming years.
Yeah, and if you're joining the company later, or maybe you're the first RevOps hire, asking certain questions during the interview process really sets the right tone and allows you to establish yourself really quickly as a strategic thinker.
Yeah.
So, for example, and part of this is just experience, asking how they're financed. Is it private equity or is it venture backed? Because that's going to really change the priorities. Private equity, you're typically looking to sell the company at some point. So you want to minimize costs, maximize profit margins. And it may not mean the same type of growth that you would see at venture backed, where new customer acquisition and then retention and expansion is going to be your sole motto. Are there other questions you recommend asking in the interview process, or people you would insist on speaking to, like the CEO, as part of the interview process?
I think if you look, or questions that I asked also when joining Leapsome, I asked, what worries you? What do you think about when you think about the upcoming period? What are challenges that you feel like you need to overcome? And how can revenue operations play a part in that? Because then I think you also get a sense of what the operational day-to-day also will look like. So you get a little bit away from very big philosophical questions. And it's also a way for the CEO, if that's the person you're talking to actually, okay, someone actually wants to listen to my problems. And that usually gives fairly interesting dialogue. I would also think about what has happened maybe in the past year. What are you especially proud of? What have you been doubling down on? Because that's also a clue to what's the strategy? What are they actually working on right now? Have they launched new products? Are they entering new markets? What have they been working on up until now? And then especially if you're the first revenue operations hire, why are you hiring right now? What triggered this process right now? Why are you looking into this? What's your vision for the function? Because that's also a clue. Are they now starting to scale more rapidly? Do they need structured reporting for potentially looking at being acquired? Whatever it might be, because that's also really interesting. What kind of triggered the need right now for a revenue operations person, just as an example?
Yeah, those are great questions. I think the best way to approach this is possibly starting with maybe walking through some examples of some company scenarios and how RevOps can support them. It's difficult because I think a lot of executives want a silver bullet fix. They see a problem, they want it to be one thing that's wrong, that's fixed, and everything's fine. But usually it's much, much more insidious than that. And it can be hard to break the news. So maybe we talk through some scenarios and how RevOps can start thinking about helping the company meet those objectives. I guess I'll give you one. So private equity, and we want to sell in 2 years. Our biggest struggle has been retention on the customer side.
Yep. As revenue operations, you have to a lot of times play the detective role. So really trying to figure out, okay, why is retention a struggle for us? And trying to take one step back to be like, okay, can we look at trends? Can we look at different segments? Can we look into the data? Because at least my experience is that when you go and talk to a frontline manager or even reps, you have a lot of recency bias, you have a lot of individual examples, but really trying to identify the patterns, the underlying patterns. And that's the areas where RevOps can truly shine. I was having this discussion with someone recently about looking at the funnel and conversion in terms of leakage and trying to identify those breaking points. And if you then start looking at the customer lifecycle, not just as a holistic, okay, we're seeing churn, but when in the life cycle is this churn happening? Are there specific touch points or specific usage trends that we can maybe identify? So really trying to drill down into why and where it's happening. So we actually had an interesting example of this a while ago. We were looking into churn and when churn is happening. And we saw that some of the churn was actually happening right after onboarding. Just a small portion, but still, we were like, this feels like it's off. Why can, we should be able to fix, because this is not due to, budget cuts or renewal or anything else. So really going deep down into the problem. So first asking the top level question and then really, really drilling all the way down and then trying to unlock that little knot, so to speak, and fixing that leakage. So that's one way of doing it, but not stopping also at just accepting the problem at the surface level.
And that's perfect. And I wanted to start there because I wanted to show the example of where your focus shifts and where you want to pay attention, because chances are really high that you're given a long list of wants. But if you know the overall strategy and your main issue is customer retention, you have a much better chance of convincing those executives that let's put a pin in what you're asking for because we have this problem here. We'll get to it. But issue number one is this. Do you have any insights into why that might be happening? Getting their opinion on it so they feel involved? Yeah. What are other ways a revenue operations person has been at the company for quite a while? They're used to taking requests. Maybe they aren't very senior, but they want to move to a more strategic advisor and have more direction in the roadmap. How would you advise they really go about doing that?
So I work a lot with both myself and my team members in trying to, at least for yourself, time box your capacity. And it's just a very useful tool, especially as you're trying to move from more junior to a bit more senior, because, our junior colleagues tend to be more task intake, fixing fires, data requests. But then for yourself, trying to think about it as, okay, maybe I now move to trying to time box maybe 30% of my capacity to more strategic initiatives. What do I feel is relevant? What do maybe my manager ask for me? And then trying to formulate that in your own little roadmap. And then trying to be as strict as possible with yourself to actually also dedicate that time to working on bigger initiatives. And when you start doing that, you also visualize for yourself, how am I actually spending my time? Is it a lot of firefighting that feels very urgent in the short term, but in the long term, maybe it's more important that I actually hold myself accountable to some of these other larger initiatives that I set out for myself? And then you can start playing around with that. But as soon as you start to visualize it for yourself and actually start to prioritize, okay, if I now have this other dedicated time that I want to prioritize for more strategic initiatives, what could that be? Okay, who do I need to talk to? Which stakeholders do I need to align with, or just sit in on a few meetings to understand what's going on, to have context on some of these issues? So it's a very simple tool, but I think if you start there, you can at least start moving in that direction.
Let's maybe talk about some of the benefits as an individual contributor when you had that aha moment where you went from processing things as they come in and feeling good about swooping in and saving something to really changing the conversation.
Yeah. So for me, it's easy to get stuck in the task intake or fixing small asks. It's also very nice and pleasant when you have someone come ask you for help, you help them, they're very happy. But for me, at least the trigger was being very, very stretched on capacity. This is something that a lot of RevOps people can relate to. So I was really, really short on capacity. And I had to be tough with myself in, okay, how do I actually prioritize my own time? Where do I spend my brain power, my capacity? And then obviously when you take that step back and start being like, okay, what can I actually take out? Where do I spend my time? It feeds, at least to me, then I need to really spend my time where it has the most impact. So I took a step back, went back to actually the strategy and the big bets. And if I actually spend time on this here and this solution, will it bring us closer to what we actually said we need to achieve in this period? Or am I just doing busy work because it feels urgent right now, but it's actually not going to move the needle on these kind of bigger topics? So when you start asking yourself that question, also more and more often, am I actually now contributing to this kind of big bets that we said that we would have to work on? And this needs to be true for us to be successful as a company. It becomes a lot easier to prioritize your time. It adds another layer of gratification when you actually finalize a more complex project, because then you can feel like, okay, we're actually now kind of moving this big ship towards the bigger goals instead of just firefighting the small tasks, which at least after a while, it can get tedious as well. So having that sort of system of prioritization for yourself, but that also needs to be rooted in our initial discussion of actually knowing what are the big goals? What do we need to do as a company for you to be able to do that sort of prioritization exercise?
Yeah, that really resonates because I had that similar moment where if you're just knocking things off a list, the list never ends. And it doesn't feel like you're really going anywhere Whereas when you understand what the strategy is and where the big problems are and you fix those and you start to see a real impact on the business, that's just way more exciting to me.
Absolutely. And then you start uncovering other things attached to those solutions that you're like, oh, okay. And then we see knock-on effects, or we found other issues that can help us even more go in the right direction. So you start seeing that kind of momentum build, hopefully.
So how do you coach members of your team to look at things a little different? If you have an analyst or an admin, we call that out specific, not them out. This could be a different company, pretend it's a different scenario, but we have an analyst who's very passionate about creating these really complex reports. How do you think about coaching them to really align more with the overall strategy?
So in my experience, a good way to start is by making sure that they're actually also included in knowing what's going on outside their immediate team, because that's also inspiring and motivating for them. So trying to bring back discussions that happened in the go-to-market leadership, for example, back to the team and just say, hey, this is what's going on. We had this challenge, or we discussed the QBR, these things came up, and this is why we are now as a team working on solution X, Y, Z. So trying to be clear and provide that context, because otherwise it's also easier that you get really bogged down just in your own little reality, which is very natural. But then I try to, as just a coaching tool, I tend to ask a lot of questions. So like, okay, why do you feel like this is important right now? Who were you doing it for? Why do you want to set up the solution in this way? Because then it's also easier to start resonating with them and discussing the potential solution and being like, yeah, I understand what you're saying, but I talked to the VP of sales and this and that, and it becomes more of a dialogue. But also asking a lot of questions, making them think for themselves, okay, why do I actually prioritize this right now? If we also know that these are the big goals, the big projects, what we're working on right now. So trying to be guiding without telling them.
That's a hard thing to do. And speaking of trying to guide without telling them, let's shift gears a little bit and think about this from a managing up perspective. So our manager has 5 top priorities. How do you recommend going about getting them refocused on the overall objective?
Yeah, this is the tricky one.
Mm-hmm.
That's a constant struggle. But for me, something that at least helps me is having pre-aligned on priority. As I mentioned at the beginning, actually aligning on the overall goals or priorities for maybe the entire go-to-market, but then also, okay, what are revenue operations going to do? What are your priorities, etc.? Because at least for me, my experience is that it's always easier when you can relate back to a previous discussion, because it's a lot easier to hold yourself accountable if you once articulate what you're going to do or what you need to do. Same thing then with, for example, reprioritization, which I think a lot of people can relate to. You say, this is what we're going to do, but then things catch on fire, new ideas happen. That's fine. But then at least if you have asks coming in, or if you have a VP suddenly running off and wanting to do something else, you can at least ask the question, okay, I see you want to do this right now, or you're asking me to do this, but we said we're going to do all these things. Can't do both. Can't do all of it. Which one then do you want to take out? And then I think it's easier to start reeling them back in or holding yourself accountable to your initial plan. So having that clarity going in is very helpful.
So, hypothetical situation. You have a CEO who has shiny object syndrome, and they haven't found product market fit yet. So they have a new idea very frequently, and they want to shift the strategy accordingly. What's a good sign that maybe it's time to move on because this isn't going to work long term? Like, how do you balance, this is going to get the company in trouble with your ability to impact things positively over given a chance to do something for 6 months as opposed to having to change it every couple months?
Yeah. Trying to, when you actually go into a new product area, whatever it might be, also identifying what are the indicators that will tell us that we're on the right path. What are the data points that we can look at, and being also very mindful of what are actually leading and lagging indicators, which sort of data points can we look at with what frequency, etc. So at least, even if something can be very new, it can be very difficult, but then at least knowing what are we actually looking at, what will tell us if we're on the right path. Because then you can routinely be like, okay, are we on track? Are we off track? How far off track are we? So that you can at least have somewhat of a road staked out. So if you don't start diverging from that road, because going in completely blank is very, very difficult. So for me, we always try to identify those milestones that will tell us that we're on the right track. And then, of course, if you start diverging too far off on too many of those, it's time to maybe go back to the drawing board. And I think revenue operation can play that role also in feeding into those discussions, but then also keeping a lookout for other sprouts or whatever you want to call them. So if we see, hey, we're actually seeing unexpected positive trends over here, is that something that we can bring back in? How many of these are we seeing? For how long have we been seeing this trend? Both holding people accountable, but then also trying to feed in a little bit to the discussion.
Yeah, and my bias showed a little bit, because if I could give myself advice, it would be when you try and you put guardrails around and they keep insisting that the things you're pointing out don't feel right and aren't the real problem. So we keep going down these rabbit holes that aren't productive. Eventually, that's pretty demoralizing, and it's probably time to reevaluate things. But I think all of the points you had are super fantastic before taking that step in putting those guardrails there and really setting clear expectations on, here are the kind of metrics I would expect to see if something's working. And I'll be looking for any signals that something else is working at the same time and really working together on that.
Yeah. And revenue operations can paint different scenarios. So we're seeing these trends right now. We're tracking these KPIs. If this continues and we keep doing this for 6 months, this is where we would end up. If we manage to change conversion in this or that step in either direction, this could happen. So trying to also frame the discussion a little bit and not just looking at shows, but what if we actually extrapolate what we're seeing? Or are we making now an assumption that we can improve over here? What would that mean? When do we need to do this to be able to be successful? So that's also trying to model, show potential results.
I like it. So is there anything about aligning with overall strategy that I haven't asked you about that you would like to bring up?
Now I have to think through. I feel like we've covered a lot of important things.
Yeah.
No, but I do think we've touched upon it, I think, multiple times, but really be strict with yourself and your capacity and try to balance long-term versus short-term. What do I need to do maybe right here and right now because there is a fire, but don't deprioritize completely your time for long-term strategic initiatives because it will only keep causing fires. So that's just something, it's really, really tricky, but trying to hold yourself accountable to your plan and to how you spend your time, because that way you will also make it easier for yourself tomorrow, and you will definitely have a greater impact on the company's success in the long run.
I love it. So I heard you're going to be speaking at RevOpsAF. Similar topic. Was this a little preview of what's to come?
Yes. So we will be talking about aligning strategy and revenue operations. It will be a panel discussion. So it will be super interesting to also hear other people's experiences and have a dialogue on this topic. It's one of my favorite topics, going all the way from the strategy down to the operational. So I'm really excited to talk about this in Berlin as well.
Kristina, thank you so much for being on. I appreciate you. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Where can folks find you to network a little bit?
I am on LinkedIn. You will find me. I'm probably the only person there with my name, so I'm easy to find. Please connect with me, and especially if you want to talk about anything go-to-market strategy, revenue operations, I am there. I look forward to speaking with more new connections.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode, everybody.
For more great content like this, join our community at RevOpsCoop.com and check out the links provided in the show notes.
Keep it RevOpsAF, y'all.